Good afternoon, everyone. I know that these are like really stressful times for everybody within academia. Like half the students, half the people are writing exams and the other half are grading them, which means that this is like the worst time in the year to do anything, which is why we are doing it now. Um, my name is Nishant Shah. I'm an associate professor of global communications and media at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the School of Journalism and Communication, where a lot of you are. If you are wondering why I'm saying these obvious things, is because we have a whole bunch of people on Zoom who are not here in person and they might not know who we are. I just wanted to thank you for making the time today and welcome all of you to the inaugural event of the Digital Narratives Studio. I am the director of the Digital Narrative Studio. There are a whole bunch of people who are helping me build it, who are also here online and in person. And I just want to kind of talk about the Digital Narrative Studio very, very briefly, because that's actually how Kasia and I got into a conversation. The primary reason for us to start the Digital Narrative Studio was to really think about how storytelling has become one of the most challenging terrains of contemporary cultures, right? So we did a project a few years ago. This was in collaboration with the Human Rights Funders Network, with HIVOS, and with Oxfam Novib, where they asked us to map out what would be the most challenging horizons for civil society actors in the next 5 years. As very good researchers, we thought we knew what was coming, right? Like you go into the field and you're like, oh, they're asking us to map digital challenges. It's going to be privacy and it's going to be safety and it's going to be security. And then you do like 300 different interviews and you look at your data. And then me and my team kept on staring at each other and saying, this can't be right. Are they saying storytelling is one of the biggest challenges that they see in the digital landscape? And then it was really exciting because there were three things that came out of it. One, a lot of civil society actors, NGOs, government actors were essentially saying that it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell stories that matter. That almost all the stories we tell right now are responding to somebody else's crisis. They are all stories which are illustrations of some specific crisis, and that we keep on talking about who we are fighting against, but not really what we are fighting for, which is what actually drives people to make change. And they say this is going to be a challenge. We don't know how to deal with this. The second thing they said, and this was very obvious, was that almost all of our traditional forms of storytelling are built at human scale. And almost all the attacks which are happening through misinformation, disinformation, counterinformation are through algorithmic scale. And so a lot of people were saying that there is no intergenerational transfer, right? What do we do if it's storytelling when it's no longer just at a human scale and a human function? And then the third thing, and this was my most depressing learning from that project, was when they said that the default aesthetic of storytelling right now is doom, gloom, and despair. That essentially we are building such narratives of such epic proportion that people no longer feel that they have the right to tell a story, and that if they tell a story, it would make any change, right? There is a politics of despair and apathy which has been floating around. So these was just like the basic ideas around why we wanted to start the Digital Narrative Studio. And when we began, we said, let's try and think about this in a new way. Let's think about three different things that digital narratives need research on. So the first axis was that of authorship. We really just want to examine who is a digital author, right? Not just what is a TikToker, what is an influencer, what is a blogger, and so on and so forth, but what are the new conditions of authorship that are being brought into play as they negotiate with questions of freedom of speech and expression, of different kinds of cultural production, of community voices, and so on and so forth. The second axis is an axis of authenticity, specifically thinking about what happens in a world which is now, we've naturalized the fact that we live in a post-truth world, right? So how do you talk about the questions of truth or meaning, or to be very academic, epistemologies, in a world where context has been collapsed in such a spectacular way? And then the third axis was that of authority. A lot of my work has been working in majority world countries with young people who are trying to make change. in their own environments and their communities. And it has been amazing to see how much energy the young are investing in resolving the problems of their future, be it from climate justice to data justice to health and well-being. And almost in all of them, we have seen the rise and fall of youth-led movements, leading to extraordinary forms of burnout and despair. And we kind of said that within the digital spaces, especially, there is a very easy form of organizing which is offered to us, which is one of polarization, right? It's either with me or against me, and there seems to be no way out of it. And we thought that that's not how the world really operates, right? The world operates by finding new forms of working with power, as opposed to merely just getting into a protest culture or a cancel culture or something like it. And so the third axis that we have after authorship and authenticity is authority. Right? How do you engage with power so that it becomes a meaningful conversation about building hopeful futures and centering hopeful narratives? This was the original idea of the Digital Narrative Studio. Our website is now live, so you can visit us. It's digitalnarratives.studio if you want to look at it. And the conversations with Kasia began with this because we had set out a call saying, we want to learn from people who are forwarding the ideas of what digital narratives are. How do you center hope? What are the kinds of challenges and obstacles that come on our way and we do not give up? And Kasia wrote to me and she said, I want to work for you. And I said, no, we need to learn from you and we need to work with you. And when they were visiting Hong Kong, and we are very, very excited, I think they are on a personal trip, but I'm just intercepting them and like dragging them into the Digital Narrative Studio because we would love to hear them talk. So for this afternoon, I'm going to stop speaking very soon. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, which is already on the posters. And you can, of course, know more about them if you Google them. And I think it's safe to say Google them because you used to work with Google. So I can use that as a generic search engine metaphor. All right. Kasia Chmielinski is the co-founder of the Data Nutrition Project, an initiative that builds tools to mitigate bias in artificial intelligence. They are a fellow at Stanford University focused on building responsible data systems. And previously, they held positions at the United Nations, at the US Digital Services, at MIT Lab, McKinsey & Company, and also Google. They are a purveyor of multimedia stories, and their work has been supported by organizations including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Sundance Institute, Vision Maker Media, and the NPR in the US. When not thinking about data, Kasia is usually cycling or birdwatching around the northeastern United States. And we recently found out that, like many of us in the room, 95% of their brain is thinking about food in terms of what they have recently eaten and what they're going to eat next. So that makes you a perfect fit for the Digital Narrative Studio, because largely we are just an excuse to eat a lot of food together. All right, but please join me in welcoming Kasia, and we are all yours for the next half an hour or so. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess I'll stand. Thank you for that intro. I feel like I could just listen to you keep talking. I'm like, maybe I should talk about something else. Like that's no, I'll go along with my original talk. It's really an honor to be here. I actually spent a semester and a summer at CUHK when I was an undergrad. So it's kind of amazing to be back. I did a semester abroad and I'm half Cantonese, and my mom is here in the audience, and also my personal photographer, apparently. No, but it's really great to be here. So thank you. I'm going to talk a bit today about responsible tech practices. And when I talked to Nishant earlier this year, we were kind of brainstorming what this might look like. He kept saying, I'd really like to talk about something hopeful. And that was a great prompt, because I think that a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the context is not very hopeful. And so it pushed me to think about, well, what is hopeful, and what are the things that we're doing or that we can do or that I see that are happening that could lead us to a better place. And so hopefully I'll talk a little bit about that today, and you'll get a sense of what that is. So where's the thing? Is it there? Is it here? Is it there? Hitting all the buttons. Well, next slide, please. Thank you. Awesome. So should I just hit a button here? It's no problem for me. Yeah, great. Oh, thanks. Okay. It's a blessing, when the technology doesn't work. It means that the tech gods are with you. So as Nishant already said, my name is Kasia Chmielinski. I'm a technologist. I've been building systems for basically the last 20 years and recently shifted into thinking about responsible data systems. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And I am a very enthusiastic cyclist and a bird watcher. So I know you'll have burning questions. You can hold them to the end. I'm happy to answer any questions about birds, cycling, or my work. In terms of my bio, I actually have a more technical degree. I studied physics many years ago. And when I was graduating, I looked at the possibilities for physicists, and I realized that over time, my world would probably become smaller. So if you study physics, you go into one particular part of physics, and over time, that narrows to a very, very deep understanding of one area. And I kind of saw this as a warning sign because I'm very much a generalist and I like to go more broadly and I like to go across different disciplines. And so I did a very strange thing, which no one else in my program did, which is that I decided to go into communications at Google. I don't know why they hired me. I'm very thankful that they did, but I was the only physicist, I can tell you, on the comms team. I worked in the UK at Google for several years. And it was actually one of the best decisions I made because what I realized was is that I came out of this program and I had a technical brain, but I could not tell a story. And I didn't understand a narrative. I didn't understand how the media worked. And I also couldn't do basic things like make eye contact and smile when it was appropriate, these kinds of things. I was super, super nerd. And so I learned all of this kind of on the ground while I was at Google. But one thing that I learned while I was at Google was that if your product is a bad product, you cannot tell a story that will make it a better product or make it a good product. And so based on that, I decided that what I actually wanted to do was go into product management. So I ended up going back into development and becoming a manager of engineering and design teams to actually build products in industry. That's what I did when I was at Zest. I was on a founding team of this startup that used AI to make credit scoring decisions. This was also the beginning of my enlightenment around the ethical tensions that you might have when doing things like building AI with a mission, but having unintended consequences that come out of that kind of technology. Ultimately, I ended up running a project at Scratch. I was the product lead for MIT Scratch project, which is a kids coding platform. It also happens to be the largest community of kids on the internet. That was kind of a secret. And so that was a really interesting project to work on because it was within the context of a research lab, but had at the time 5 million and now something like 35 or 40 million kids using it on a monthly average. I got called into government service after that. There was an election in the US. Someone was elected. It was contentious. It was 2016. I felt driven to actually go into service and think about representation at a higher level and the importance of people being at the table who have different identities and want to build different kinds of technology. And then ultimately, I was going to take a break. I ended up at McKinsey. I thought this will be pretty chill. It was not chill. There was a global pandemic, and I ended up working on data systems and healthcare. But kind of around the end of those dots there, I also started to do multiple other things, including much more storytelling, became a researcher at a number of institutions and starting to advise on data strategy. And so, my journey is really one of someone who's building things and realizing the impact of the systems that I was building and starting to think, well, how might we actually do this better? How could we build technology that works better and for more people? And so I think in order to answer this question, which I will get to, it makes sense to talk a bit about how we build today. And I think the most important thing to know is that it's market driven. I don't think it's going to be surprising for anybody in the room. The graph on the right-hand side, this is US venture capital investments and the return. What you need to see here is basically that a very small number of investments account for the majority of the returns. So 6% of the investments create 60% of the returns, and over half of all of the investments actually lose money. So when you're in a market that looks like this, and this is what your investors are looking for, you are trying so hard to be the 6%. That is the most important thing, is that you convince everybody that you are the 6% so that you can go ahead and give them their returns. And this is VC and this is US. I think Same general principle applies if you're thinking of private corporations that have that have gone public, or private corporations with boards. It's kind of the same principle, right? You're driven by the return. So in order to convince people that you are going to return their money to them, that you're going to do well by the investors, you actually have to have growth goals. You have to have metrics. And it turns out that you are what you measure. So if what you're measuring is your growth, you will do everything that you can to hit those metrics. So whatever you define is the thing that defines your work. And that means at the CEO level, you're driving your teams to hit those metrics. It means at a product manager, engineer level, you have to also hit certain metrics in order to get your bonus, in order to keep your job, right? This is just an example. This is Frances Haugen, who was a product manager at Facebook and I think at Google previously, and she ended up being a whistleblower and bringing a lot of documents into the public light that showed what was happening at Facebook. And I won't read the whole thing, but essentially she saw that Facebook repeatedly encountered conflict between its profits and its safety. Right, the safety of its tools. And that's exactly what happens. You know, if you're really, really focused on one set of metrics, there's going to be trade-offs with other things, often privacy, safety, usability, you know, the ability for other people who are outside your target market to actually use your technology. And this is something that happens to Facebook, but it's happening at every single level in the industry. So what this means for a product manager like myself is that you're driven by particular metrics that align all the way up to growth goals for the company. And you're building for a particular user. And the idea is you build fast for that user and you get to the rest of them later, right? So if you hit your metrics, you'll get your funding, and then you can go ahead and include the folks who don't speak English later. You can include the folks who don't have the most recent iPhone later, folks who live in rural areas later. And you're really focused at the middle of the bell curve. Or maybe it's more of like a long tail, it doesn't matter. So, you know, if that's the way that you are building, that means that you are literally not building for everybody. That is part of the strategy. That's not a side effect. That's actually how you are taught to build. And that's how I was taught to build, right? I have a physics degree and then I went into comms. Like I didn't go to school for product management. So you're learning on the ground when you're actually building these things in teams. And what this ends up meaning too is that the point at which you're looking for unintended consequences is at the end of the build cycle. So you have strategy around what you're building. You are designing the thing that you're building, you're developing it, and then you talk to legal, you talk to marketing, you talk to comms, you talk to compliance, right? You do your testing. And if you pass all of these, you launch. And if you don't pass them, well, it might be really expensive to go back to the beginning. So you might just like put a Band-Aid on it or say that you'll like get to it later, and then you push it out the door. So it's very much a reactive kind of a process. There was a, let's see, what do you call it? Manifesto that was published a little while ago by a guy in the VC world, very, very powerful. And he actually named this column here, this pink column, as anti-innovation. So there's actually a narrative out there in the world, in tech, that if you try to build safely and you're trying to have these stage gates, that's actually anti-innovation. It's going to slow you down. Right? As opposed to saying, hey, these are things that we should be considering earlier in the process, or we should actually have some time allocated in the timeline to do these things. No, it's seen as actually the enemy of getting something out the door. The result is that we build products that don't work for everyone, right? So to kind of tie it into my personal journey, I ended up building a number of products that literally didn't work for me and a lot of the people in the communities that I love. Right. So one example is we were building a voice search and we were training this AI on the Queen's English. Right. So we had all this English this English language data set, basically, that we could scrape from all these archives, perfect English, according to the Queen, RIP. And, we just trained the whole thing on this English data set. And we're like, here we go, out the door. And I remember, because I was working on that team, we then very excitedly were beta testers. I tested it. It didn't work on me because I have an American accent. You know, I had people test it who were not native English speakers, who spoke with an accent, and it didn't work for them either. It turns out most people don't speak like the Queen, right? But that is exactly what we trained it on. And thus, that's how the product worked. It works exactly how you trained it, right? And again, it was the bell curve. We had the data. We figured this is English. This is the perfect English in the region that I was based in. And so that's what we're going to use. And you can see this first article here. The voice assistants still can't do bilingual because the data sets we have are not flipping between languages or doing kind of a Chinglish or a Spanglish or something like that. It's one language, and that's the way that it's trained. And so if we don't train our systems on representative data, it's not going to work for everybody, right? The second is, right, so this one's about that startup that I was in that I helped to create, where we were making loan decisions and credit scoring decisions based on new data. And if we didn't have data about a certain population, then we couldn't actually make a loan decision about them. And this ends up being very impactful if you have someone who's new to the country. So someone has a very thin file, if they're very young, if there's historical bias, right? If people who look like them didn't get loans before, they won't be able to get loans now. And these are just some examples in the media, but also tied directly to things that I worked on that I started to see in the work that I was doing over the last 20 years that I've been building systems. People ask me, well, how is this going to change with generative AI? Like everyone wants to talk about ChatGPT. Happy to talk about it later if you want to talk about it. I think personally, TLDR is it's going to be exacerbated by, the issues are going to be exacerbated by this new AI growth for 3 reasons, right? So the issues that I just talked about, they exist in traditional AI. Now you have this new wave of AI that is even less transparent. So GPT, for example, we have no idea what they trained it on. No idea. We have no idea how they trained it. And now that it's launched, we don't know how they're updating it and why and when. Like literally, we just have no idea. And there's no regulation, there's no policy that says they have to explain any of this to us. So first of all, lack of transparency into it, how it works. Second, it's just the scale and the reach of this AI is so enormous. I mean, I think the uptake of ChatGPT was the fastest signups that we'd ever seen on an app, right? Or any kind of technology. So it's not so much that the AI is so different, but rather it's going to be ubiquitous. Like it's going straight to consumer, and all the services that are being built on top of these generative AI services are going to go straight to consumer. And then third, the consolidation of the market. So you have fewer players, which means less openness, less market dynamics, and less consumer choice. And often when you have lots of different players, you can choose something that works a little better for you that drives competition in the market, which makes better products, generally speaking. I think this graph is insane, so I put it here. So what this is it's showing you over time who is responsible for launching notable AI systems. And what you should really focus on is the blue and how the blue disappears at the end, right? So I'm just going to read it to you so you don't have to, if you don't like graphs, it's okay. Basically, blue is all of the advancements that are coming out of academia, which means it's open, it's published, right? And these folks are working maybe on, they're getting government grants. It's kind of in the public interest. For example, I mean, I know academia is also problematic in many ways. But look at what's happened in the last 5 years. The blue is literally gone. And it's turned into red, and red is industry, which means that a lot of these advancements that are happening in AI are happening now behind closed doors. People are going straight to the Googles, the DeepMinds, the Metas, et cetera, and doing their research there. But it's not exactly a research lab because they don't have to publish things. They don't have to explain to people how they're doing things. And it might actually be in their best interest to not talk about it publicly because they can use it in their private company to build products that give them an edge in the market, right? So the consolidation is also a huge deal. Finally, people say, well, what about regulation? Regulation is going to help us, right? Yes, regulation's coming, but it is fragmented. It's different across all these different countries, and it's very reactive. So what we're seeing is actually a result of what's happening out there, as opposed to something that's proactive. And that's probably what you want with regulation anyway. But it's not necessarily going to help us when it comes to some of these issues in AI that we've been seeing for over a decade now. And this graph just shows, there's kind of 3 different approaches generally to regulating AI. There's adjusting or kind of modifying or updating existing laws. There's creating AI specific frameworks. And then there's just saying you can't use that, which is a strategy. Okay, so that's all like quite doom and gloomy. Good, we've got people joining, so they've missed all the sad part. That's very good. Um, but I was asked to talk a bit about hope, so I'm going to try to do that and segue into, all right, considering all of that, you have the market dynamics, you have the introduction of this new AI, you have the way that people have been taught to build, and you have regulation that's kind of racing to catch up, but not quite there. What can we actually do about this? So when I think about this in my own work, there is an option and opportunity for us to be more proactive about the way we build. And I think that's really three different things. And I will have examples of this. So this is just a summary page and we'll come back to it. The first is we need to be thinking of this as a by design problem. We cannot be thinking about compliance and risk and harm and mitigation at the end of a cycle. We need to think about it from the very beginning and build it into the way that we actually think about our products, right? So it's safety by design, it's privacy by design. It means integrating this into the processes that already exist. But that's not enough because you have one product manager who wants to do it right. But if all of the metrics and the operations and the processes are stacked against them, they actually can't really make a change. So what you need is support from the actual organizations. The leadership needs to actually buy into this. If you're going to take more time to design something and do it well, that can't be on top of your normal job. That has to be part of your job, right? So you actually have to see change inside of organizations and operations. And third, you have to involve the people who are affected. If you can't actually get people onto the team, which is the best way to do it, then at least make sure you're talking to people like the way that you did hundreds of interviews to try to understand the space. Because I promise you're going to find something that you didn't expect to find. So I have two examples here. The first is an organization that I co-lead with a bunch of very smart people called the Data Nutrition Project. And we build nutrition labels like the ones on food for data sets. Now, the way that we came to be was actually through a fellowship that was jointly held between MIT and Harvard. And we're all kind of mid-career folks. And this was right around the time that I started thinking, oh no, what am I building? This is terrible. I should maybe start to do something else. And so I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll just get a fellowship because that's what you do, right? So I got a fellowship. And the question of the fellowship was, how might you think about ethical AI? And I was sitting in a room with a bunch of people who are also a little bit burned out from industry. And we were eating cookies, as you do, because I think about cookies most of the time. And I think one of us kind of looked at the back of the box of the cookies and we're like, why can we see inside the box of cookies, but we can't see inside the AI? Why is this possible here, but we can't do this for these systems? And shouldn't we be able to? Right? What we were seeing was that, in the media at the time, it was 2018, all of this kind of realization that we had built bad AI, right? But when you actually looked under the surface, what was happening was that systems that are built on bad data had bad outcomes. It's actually not rocket science. Right. So, for example, this top one here, this person was misidentified by facial recognition algorithms and ended up getting pulled in and charged for something that he did not do by the police. Turns out that those systems are built on the faces of people who have different skin colors, not very dark skin colors. So it just doesn't do well on people with dark skin colors. Just does poorly, right? Then you have the suicide risk prediction model. This is someone comes into an ER or something, they fill out a form, it takes a look at that and says you're at a high risk or a low risk of suicide. But the original training data set just didn't include a bunch of communities. So if I'm from that community and I come in, the algorithm just doesn't know what to do with me. It gives me a bad score, or a score that's completely irrelevant. That's actually quite dangerous. And then finally, Amazon created this hiring tool. You probably heard about it. It was built on historic data that looked at resumes of people who had been hired. It turns out that we have a gender problem historically when it comes to hiring people. And so the AI said, oh, I recognize a pattern. Every woman that I see, I'm just going to deny them the job. Problem solved, right? So again, this is a problem here where you have problematic data and it creates problematic AI. It's not really rocket science. So our big aha moment was, oh, wait, shouldn't we interrogate the data for bias before we build the model? Right? I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but if you're a data scientist, it's a wild west. You can get any data from anywhere. You can do whatever you want to it. And no one checks it for anything. There's no standardized tools. There's no standardized documentation. If you are somebody who cares, you'll look at it in a way that maybe you can identify some bias, but it's really up to you. And so we thought, well, instead of doing it at the end of the deployment cycle, why don't we move it up, right? So why don't we do this by design? Why don't we say that when you create the data set, or when you initially take the data set off the shelf to decide whether to use it, that's when you see this kind of nutrition label. So we've had 3 versions of this. The first was very, very quantitative and looked a lot like a nutrition label on like we have on food in the US and in other countries as well. Turns out that people don't really care about the quantitative things. They want to know about the qualitative information, like what data did you remove and why, and who paid for this and why. Then our second was incredibly opinionated. We're like, this has bias. It turned out that nobody wanted to work with us who owned data because we just kept saying their data was bad. So we backed off of that one. It also is very hard to kind of objectively talk about bias because it depends on where you are. And, you know, if you're in one part of the world, bias looks different from in another part of the world. So we backed off of that one and ended up with this third one that we announced earlier this year, maybe last year, which is more like it tells you kind of the ingredients of what's inside, and then it throws up warnings for things that you might need to think about if you're going to use the data set. So intended uses, things that you shouldn't use it for, ways that it has been used before. And so this is kind of what we've built. The second example of ways that you can kind of proactively maybe insert yourself into technology processes to make them better and for more people is this notion of safety by design. And it's a project I'm working on now. It's an American consumer product company that wants to build a chatbot. Everyone wants to build a chatbot, right? And they're thinking, oh, this is going to be fantastic. And then they met me and I said, it sounds like it's going to be fantastic. And also, what are you going to do about safety? And they were like, safety? What do you mean? Well, you know, you're inheriting a bunch of risk from this underlying technology, and then you're building a system on top of that, which, as I've showed you, has a lot of other potential risks. So what are you going to do about that? And they're like, oh, maybe we'll like deal with that down the line. And so I talked to them a bunch and said, why don't we try to build it into the first version and see if that's possible? And so that's what we've been doing. So I kind of just explained this, but essentially we are moving into a situation where we're going to see an explosion of new services on top of things like GPT, Llama 2, DALL-E, Midjourney, etc. And what this means is kind of like on your mobile phone. I don't know how old people are. I will not ask people. But I could out myself by saying that initially the phone was just a phone and you could text and that was it. And then one day there was an app store and it took off. That's about to happen, right? So that's about to happen for AI. And we're about to have a bunch of new apps and services that are built on top of this new layer of generative AI foundation models, right? Like GPT. So this is a picture of the stack. And there are those apps that are going to show up very soon / are already showing up now. The challenge of this is when you're building new technology, there are your own risks, like the ones I already talked about. You're building for a particular set of users, for a particular kind of use case, and you might miss other people. But also you inherit all the risks of the third-party system, which in this case is GPT, the large language model, right? And the risks are not transparent. We actually really don't know how GPT was built, what it was trained on. There are data privacy issues, there are cybersecurity issues. And so how do you actually do safety by design when you're inheriting risks and you have your own risks as well? Very fun problem. This is what I do, the other 5% of my brain when I'm not thinking about food. So safety begins during the design phase. And this is what we've done. We started with values. So what are our values with respect to user privacy, consent, trustworthiness, fairness, bias, these kinds of things. And then we took the values and we turned that into a taxonomy of real risks. So for example, you might have data privacy risks due to the large language model regurgitating someone else's information to you, right? So whatever that language model is trained on, it could give that back to you. It could give you back Kasia's phone number and address and any other personal information it has about me if someone queries it. And then we said, all right, now how do we take that risk taxonomy, so the things that actually might happen, the real harms that might occur, and how do we build that into the product? How do we start to mitigate that in the product? I will not show you the full spreadsheet because I love spreadsheets, but not everybody does. But ultimately, this turns into a number of product features. And then we determine which ones we need to build first and which ones we build later, because it always will be a trade-off. And you do want the thing to eventually launch, right? You have to be practical about it. So in this case, we look at by product area, the data, the model, the UI, and also by the development pipeline. And we start saying, where are all the places where we could implement safety features to address the risks that then go up to our values, right? And that's I don't know how to explain this. Is incredibly different from the way that you would build a normal product, where you think about safety and risks way later when a lawyer says, have you considered like having a product that's legal? And you go, oh man, I didn't even think about that. And they're like, oh my God, these product managers, right? So this is very different. This is talking to the lawyers before. This is talking to your designers before. This is talking to the people who are affected before, right? So we actually did a whole survey trying to understand what are the risks, because this is a new area entirely, right? And baking that all into the work. So in summary, today we're building products to hit key performance indicators that are mostly about growth, that are mostly about revenue, right? We are looking for unintended consequences at the very end. So shifting to something like safety by design that's integrated in with organizational support, like I'm able to get with this consumer product company, where people actually say, hey, that's a good idea, either because they're scared or because they actually do think it's a good idea. And then making sure that you're building alongside affected people and bringing people into the process is the way that I have addressed this notion of building better technology for more people, hopefully. And that's it. Happy to take questions if you have any.